It started on a night I never expected, when laughter turned into silence and a simple mistake opened a door I never thought I would walk through. My husband was too drunk to notice, too lost in his own world to see the way her eyes lingered on me. She was his niece, younger, vibrant, and full of a dangerous curiosity that made my heart race in ways I couldn't explain. I should have looked away, I should have ignored the warmth in her smile, but instead, I found myself leaning closer. What began as an innocent game between two restless souls soon grew into something far more intimate, something I knew could never be spoken aloud. And that night, while the world outside slept, I discovered a truth about myself that I had been burying for far too long. That night began like so many others, yet it carried a weight I couldn't name until it was too late. My husband had been drinking since the afternoon, the kind of careless drinking that turns laughter into slurred words and heavy footsteps. I watched him stumble from the living room to the bedroom, collapsing on the bed without so much as a second glance in my direction. For years, I had grown used to these moments, to being invisible in my own marriage, to filling the silence with thoughts I dared not speak. But that night, something was different, because I was not alone. She was there, his niece, visiting us for a few weeks. She was younger, full of energy, and her presence had a way of cutting through the stale air that hung in our home. I had noticed her before, in small ways that felt harmless at the time. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way she laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, the way her eyes sometimes held mine a little too long. I brushed it off as youthful boldness, but deep down, I knew there was something else simmering beneath the surface. When my husband finally passed out, she and I were left alone in the living room. The television flickered, casting shadows across her face, and I felt an uneasy warmth spread through me. She caught my gaze and smiled, not the polite smile of family, but something softer, something that reached into me and pulled up feelings I had buried for years. I tried to look away, but her eyes lingered, almost daring me to hold on. We began talking, small, ordinary things at first, about movies, about music, about the way my husband always drank too much when he thought no one cared. Her laughter filled the room, and I realized how long it had been since I had laughed like that, without restraint, without fear of judgment. Every word she spoke seemed to peel away another layer of the silence I had wrapped around myself for so long. The minutes stretched into hours, and I found myself leaning closer, drawn to her in a way that both terrified and excited me. I could smell the faint sweetness of her perfume, mixed with something raw and youthful, and it sent a shiver down my spine. She noticed it too. I could see it in the way her breath caught, in the way her fingers fidgeted nervously against the edge of the couch. The air between us grew heavier, charged with something unspoken. I told myself it was wrong, that she was family by marriage, that I was supposed to be loyal, but loyalty felt like a chain in that moment, one that had bound me to a life of loneliness and denial. She leaned in a little closer, her voice softer now, her words carrying a weight I couldn't ignore. She told me she had always admired me, that she saw in me a strength she wished she had. My chest tightened at her confession, because no one had spoken to me like that in years. My husband had forgotten how to see me, how to cherish me, how to notice the woman I still was beneath the routine and disappointment. But here she was, seeing me, really seeing me, and it felt like oxygen rushing into lungs that had been starved for too long. I should have pulled back, should have ended the moment before it grew into something I couldn't control, but instead, I stayed. I let the silence settle between us, heavy and intoxicating, until even the sound of our breathing felt too loud. My heart raced as if it were trying to warn me, but my body betrayed me, leaning ever so slightly toward hers. And in that fragile, dangerous closeness, I realized that something inside me had awakened, a part of me that had been asleep for far too long, waiting for a night like this to remind me it was still alive. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the television, a forgotten movie playing in the background while my husband slept in the other room, lost in his drunken dreams. The stillness of the night made every sound louder, the clink of the glass as she set it down on the table, the rhythm of her breathing, the way her laughter would trail off into something softer when our eyes met. I felt as though the walls of that living room had become a secret world, sealing us away from the rest of reality, a place where nothing mattered except the pull that drew me toward her. She leaned back against the couch, her hair falling over her shoulder, and for a moment I let myself watch her without guilt. She looked so young, yet there was something in her eyes that carried a kind of knowing, a maturity that didn't fit her age but made her feel less like a girl and more like a mirror reflecting something I had long forgotten about myself. I told myself it was only curiosity, that this was nothing more than a fleeting moment between two restless souls who happened to be awake while the rest of the house slept. But my body betrayed my thoughts, the quickening of my pulse, the way my palms grew warm and restless, the way my voice softened without me meaning it to. She noticed, I could tell, because her gaze lingered longer than it should have, and her smile carried a quiet daring, as if she wanted to see how far I would let this unspoken thing go. She started asking me questions that dug deeper than small talk. What did I dream of before I got married? Did I ever feel trapped in a life I didn't choose? Did I ever wonder what it would feel like to be with someone who truly saw me? Her words were blades wrapped in silk, gentle, but cutting straight to the truths I had spent years trying to bury. My throat tightened as I tried to answer, because every question reminded me of the things I had lost, the dreams I gave up when I married too young, the passion that faded into routine, the love that turned into duty. I wanted to lie, to push the questions aside with a smile, but the way she looked at me, with patience, with hunger for something real, forced me to be honest in a way I hadn't been in years. I told her I used to dream of living in the city, of working in art, of traveling, of waking up every day next to someone who made me feel alive. She listened without judgment, her eyes never leaving mine, and when I finished speaking, she said softly that she wished she could be that person for me. The words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous, and my heart nearly stopped. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know if she was serious or if she was simply playing with fire, but the intensity in her eyes told me it wasn't a joke. Something inside me cracked open in that moment, something that had been buried under years of silence, and I felt the ache of wanting in a way that made me tremble. She shifted closer on the couch, just a few inches, but it felt like a mile. I could feel the warmth of her body, the faint brush of her knee against mine, and the tension that filled the space between us was so thick I could hardly breathe. I wanted to stop it, to remind myself of the lines that shouldn't be crossed, but my body didn't move away. Instead, I stayed rooted in place, caught between fear and desire, between loyalty and the hunger to finally feel something real. Her hand rested lightly on the couch cushion near mine, and for a long moment we didn't speak. It was as though the silence itself was alive, pressing us closer, daring us to acknowledge what was happening. My chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, my mind screaming at me to walk away, but my heart whispering that maybe, just maybe, this was what I had been waiting for all along. And as her fingers inched closer to mine, not quite touching but close enough to send a shiver through my entire body, I realized there was no going back. Something had shifted between us, and no matter what happened next, the night had already changed everything. The moment her hand hovered so close to mine, I felt my entire body tremble with a mix of fear and anticipation. It was such a small thing, the almost touch of skin against skin, yet it carried the weight of everything I had been denying for so long. My husband's steady snores echoed faintly from the bedroom down the hall, a cruel reminder that I was still bound by vows, by a marriage that had long since stopped feeling alive. But the silence in that living room was louder than his presence, louder than my conscience. I could hear my heart beating in my ears, feel the heat rise in my chest, and sense the shift in the air as her eyes locked onto mine. She didn't look away this time. There was no pretense, no mask of innocence. She was staring at me as though she knew exactly what I was feeling and was daring me to admit it. My lips parted, but no words came out. What could I possibly say that wouldn't break the fragile thread holding us in that moment? She tilted her head slightly, her hair spilling across her face, and she gave the faintest smile, one that held no mockery, no games, just the quiet truth of someone who was just as drawn in as I was. My fingers twitched, and before I could think, before I could stop myself, I let them slide ever so slightly toward hers until our hands brushed. It was the faintest contact, just the whisper of skin against skin, but the effect was electric. A jolt shot through me, making my breath catch in my throat. I should have pulled away instantly, should have laughed it off, should have pretended it meant nothing. But instead, I left my hand there, trembling, vulnerable, aching. She didn't move at first. She just stared at me, her eyes searching mine for permission, for understanding, for something unspoken. Then slowly, deliberately, she let her fingers rest on top of mine. My chest tightened so painfully I thought I might cry. That simple touch held more intimacy than anything I had felt in years. My husband's touch had long grown cold, mechanical, a duty performed without tenderness. But this was different. Her fingers were soft, hesitant yet brave, and the warmth of her skin spread through me like fire. I wanted to close my eyes and sink into the moment, to forget the world outside, to let myself believe that it was allowed. Instead, I sat frozen, staring at our hands as if they were proof that I had finally crossed a line I couldn't uncross. She leaned closer then, her shoulder brushing mine, and whispered so softly I almost didn't hear it, "You don't have to be lonely anymore." The words sank into me like a blade wrapped in comfort. My throat tightened, tears stinging at the corners of my eyes because she didn't know how right she was. I had been lonely for so long, even with a husband in the same house, even with a marriage that looked intact from the outside. I had been starving for affection, for recognition, for someone to remind me that I was still alive. And here she was, offering it with nothing more than a touch and a whisper. My heart raced faster, torn between guilt and the intoxicating relief of finally being seen. I whispered her name, my voice shaking, as though saying it aloud would ground me in reality. But reality felt so far away. Her hand squeezed mine gently, and I turned my head toward her. Our faces were so close now that I could see every detail, the faint curve of her lips, the small freckle near her eye, the glow of youth and fire that radiated from her. The world seemed to narrow down to just that moment, just her, just us. I knew it was wrong, I knew it was dangerous, I knew it would unravel everything if it continued. Yet even as those thoughts screamed in my mind, I didn't move away. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. For the first time in years, I felt wanted. The silence stretched, our breaths mingling in the small space between us, and I knew with absolute certainty that the line had been crossed. There was no undoing it now, no erasing the touch of her hand in mine, no denying the truth my body had already confessed. Something had begun, and though I didn't know where it would lead, I knew that night had already rewritten the story of my life. Her breath lingered so close to mine that I could feel its warmth brushing against my skin, every exhale stirring something deep inside me that I had been trying to smother for years. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing closer, the silence wrapping itself around us like a secret too heavy to hold. My husband's presence in the next room felt both dangerously near and yet miles away, as though the life I had built with him belonged to another world altogether, one I no longer recognized as mine. All I could feel in that moment was her hand still resting on mine, the slight tremor in her fingers telling me she was just as unsure, just as afraid, and yet just as unwilling to let go. That tiny touch burned through me, spreading into places I hadn't felt alive in so long that I almost didn't know what to do with the sensation. My chest rose and fell unevenly, every breath shallow, as though my body was betraying me by giving away how much I wanted something I couldn't name out loud. She tilted her head, her eyes never leaving mine, and I could see the question written across her face, unspoken but so loud it filled the space between us. Was I ready to admit this? Could I even allow myself to cross the point of no return? I wanted to shake my head, to retreat, to laugh it off as a moment born of late-night conversations and loneliness, but I didn't. Instead, I held her gaze, and in doing so, I gave her all the answers she needed. The corners of her lips curved upward in a faint, trembling smile, the kind of smile that carried both fear and courage, like she was stepping off a ledge and hoping I would step with her. My throat was tight, my words trapped somewhere I couldn't reach, so I said nothing. I didn't have to. The silence between us was alive, electric, more telling than any confession could be. She shifted slightly closer, and I could feel her thigh press softly against mine, the heat of her body radiating into me in waves that left me dizzy. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, so loud I was terrified it would wake the house, but the world outside didn't matter anymore. Time had slowed, narrowed itself down to the rhythm of her breathing and the fragile press of her hand against mine. I had always thought intimacy was about grand gestures, about kisses and embraces, but in that moment I realized it could be as simple and devastating as the choice not to move away. I wanted to pull her closer, to close the space that remained between us, but the weight of what that would mean kept me frozen. I thought of the years I had given to a marriage that had dulled me into silence, of the woman I had once been who laughed freely and dreamed recklessly, of how far I had drifted from her. And now here was this girl, no, this woman, reaching across the void, reminding me of the person I thought I had lost. She leaned in just a little more, her face so close that I could see the way her lashes trembled with each blink. My pulse raced until I thought I might faint, the longing and the guilt crashing inside me in waves so fierce I couldn't catch my breath. I wanted to speak, to say something to ground us, but when I opened my mouth the only sound that came out was a soft, trembling whisper of her name. The effect on her was immediate. Her eyes softened, her grip on my hand tightened ever so slightly, and she whispered my name back, her voice shaky but filled with something I hadn't heard directed at me in years. Desire. My entire body ached at the sound, at the way she spoke it as if it mattered, as if I mattered. The clock on the wall ticked in the background, each second heavier than the last, each one daring me to make a choice. I could still pull away, still return to the safety of silence, pretend this moment never happened. But as she leaned just a breath closer, her lips hovering a hair's width from mine, I realized that the safety I thought I had been clinging to was nothing more than emptiness. The real danger wasn't in her, it was in continuing to live invisible, untouched, and unloved. My body swayed toward hers before my mind could stop it, and though we hadn't yet crossed into the territory of no return, I knew in my bones that it was only a matter of time. That night was carving itself into me, rewriting who I was, who I had been, and who I was about to become. The closeness between us grew heavier, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. My lips hovered so close to hers that the warmth of her breath brushed against me, and for a fleeting second, I thought the world might collapse if I moved just an inch forward. My thoughts spiraled in chaos, torn between the voice in my head screaming that this was wrong and the ache in my body begging me not to pull away. I had lived so long in silence, buried under duty and habit, that the idea of surrendering to something real felt almost unbearable. Her eyes searched mine, wide and uncertain but also steady with a kind of quiet bravery that pulled me in deeper. She wasn't rushing me, wasn't pushing, she was just there, waiting, like she understood the war going on inside me. I could feel her hand tightening around mine, the slight tremor in her grip betraying her nerves, and I realized she was just as scared as I was, just as lost in this storm of emotions that neither of us had planned for. That realization undid me. For years I had carried the weight of being unseen, unvalued, treated like part of the furniture in my own marriage, and now here was someone who looked at me as if every breath I took mattered. The contrast was so sharp that tears stung the corners of my eyes before I could stop them. I turned my head slightly, not away from her, but enough to break the unbearable closeness, and I whispered that I was afraid. My voice cracked, the words raw, stripped bare. Her thumb brushed softly over my knuckles, a tender, grounding touch, and she whispered back that she was too. The honesty in her voice shook me more than anything else. There was no disguise, no pretending to be braver than she was. It was just the two of us admitting we were standing on the edge of something that could shatter everything we knew. The weight of that truth made the room feel even smaller, every sound amplified, the ticking clock, the hum of the television still playing forgotten in the background, even the distant rustle of my husband shifting in his sleep. Each noise reminded me of how fragile this bubble was, how easily it could burst. And yet, despite the danger, I didn't let go of her hand. If anything, I held on tighter, my fingers weaving into hers as though I was clinging to the only lifeline I had left. The intimacy of that gesture was overwhelming. My heart pounded harder with each passing second, every beat echoing in my chest like a drum of confession. I wanted to speak, to explain the storm inside me, but no words seemed enough to capture the depth of what I felt. It wasn't just attraction, it was recognition. It was as if I had spent years wandering blind and suddenly found someone who saw me in perfect clarity. She shifted a little closer, her shoulder brushing mine again, and this time I didn't flinch. I leaned into the warmth, allowing the comfort of her body beside me to quiet the noise in my mind. She turned her face toward me, her breath steady, and for a long, aching moment we just sat there, suspended in something both terrifying and beautiful. My tears finally spilled, hot and unbidden, and before I could hide them, she reached up with her free hand and brushed one away. That simple act broke me open even further. No one had touched me like that in years, not with tenderness, not with care. My husband's touches had become cold, functional, detached. But hers was soft, reverent, as though she was afraid I might break if she pressed too hard. I let out a shaky laugh through the tears, the kind that comes from being overwhelmed, and she smiled faintly, a nervous, fragile smile that mirrored my own. The space between us seemed to hum, alive with the weight of what could happen, and I knew in that moment that whether we crossed the final line or not, everything had already changed. We had already stepped into a place we couldn't retreat from. My body leaned instinctively toward her, as if pulled by something beyond my control, and though our lips still hadn't met, I could feel the inevitability of it hanging between us like a secret waiting to be spoken. It wasn't a matter of if anymore, but when, and that truth both terrified and thrilled me. The night stretched on like it had no end, and every second between us seemed to grow heavier, more charged, as though the air itself was aware of the secret we were holding. I sat there with her hand in mine, trembling, my heart aching with a mix of fear and desire I couldn't tame. My husband's drunken snores rumbled faintly from down the hall, and each sound reminded me of the life I was still tethered to, the promises I had made, the prison of routine I had lived in for years. Yet the warmth of her fingers intertwined with mine made those thoughts blur, fading until all I could feel was the intensity of her presence. She was so close, her thigh brushing mine, her breath gentle against my cheek, and I could sense the same restless pull inside her. Every time her eyes met mine, it was like she was daring me to admit the truth, but also giving me the space to decide. That patience, that waiting, felt more intimate than any kiss. It was like she knew I was unraveling and didn't want to push me, she wanted me to choose her. I thought about how long it had been since I'd had a choice, since anyone had asked me what I wanted instead of assuming, instead of taking. With her, it wasn't about force, it was about freedom, and that realization filled my chest with a painful kind of relief. My lips parted, trembling, and I confessed in a whisper that I didn't know what I was doing, that I didn't even know how to feel anymore. My voice cracked, raw and broken, the weight of years spilling out in one fragile truth. She squeezed my hand gently and whispered back that I didn't have to know, that sometimes it was enough just to feel alive again. Her words pierced through me, cutting away the layers of numbness I had built around myself. I felt my tears slip down again, and I hated how vulnerable I was, but when I tried to hide my face, she wouldn't let me. She tilted my chin up gently, forcing me to meet her eyes. And in those eyes, I didn't see judgment or fear, I saw acceptance, a quiet fire that told me she wasn't running from this, even if it terrified her too. That kind of gaze was something I hadn't felt in years, and it broke me in ways I didn't expect. I leaned closer, my forehead brushing hers, and the simple touch was enough to make my whole body shake. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but it was closer than anything I had allowed myself to feel. Her breath mingled with mine, soft and uneven, and the closeness sent shivers through me. I could hear the rapid beat of my own heart, could almost feel hers racing in sync with mine, and it struck me how fragile this moment was. One sound from down the hall, one wrong move, and it could all collapse. But still, I didn't move away. I didn't want to. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what I was supposed to be, what I was supposed to want, or what duty demanded of me. I was thinking about myself, about the loneliness that had been gnawing at me for so long, about the hunger for affection that I had buried, about the desperate need to be seen. And she was right there, offering it without words, without conditions. I whispered that I was scared of what this would mean, that I didn't know how I could live with myself if I crossed that line. She pressed her forehead harder against mine, her hand squeezing mine tighter, and said softly that sometimes the line was never real in the first place, it was just something the world drew to keep us from choosing what we really wanted. Her words sank into me like fire, and though I didn't answer, the silence between us became its own answer. I felt myself leaning closer, inch by inch, until there was nothing left but the inevitability of what we both already knew. The night had carried us too far to turn back, and though the final step hadn't yet been taken, every part of me understood that the moment it happened, there would be no undoing it. And even in the fear, even in the guilt, there was something inside me that longed for that freedom so badly it hurt. Her nearness was suffocating in the most intoxicating way, a kind of closeness that didn't demand anything yet made denial impossible. My forehead still rested against hers, our breaths colliding in uneven rhythms, and I could feel the tremor in her body as clearly as the one running through mine. The silence between us was deafening, filled with all the words we couldn't speak, all the fears we dared not name. My husband's muffled snore drifted through the walls again, a cruel reminder of the life waiting just beyond that room, the life that tied me down like invisible chains. But here, in the dim light of the living room, I felt those chains loosening with every second I allowed myself to stay. I couldn't remember the last time I had been held in such a fragile pause, suspended on the edge of something both terrifying and liberating. She tilted her head slightly, just enough so that her nose brushed mine, and that simple touch nearly unraveled me. My pulse raced, my palms damp with nervousness, and yet I didn't pull back. Every instinct told me to retreat, to bury this moment before it bloomed into something irreversible, but another voice, the quiet, aching one that had been ignored for years, begged me to let go. That voice was louder now, stronger, demanding to be heard. I closed my eyes and let the weight of her presence wash over me. Her scent was faint but intoxicating, something sweet and unexplainable that made my stomach twist with longing. Her hand tightened around mine, grounding me, tethering me to the reality that this wasn't a dream or a fleeting thought, it was happening. I whispered, so quietly I wasn't sure she heard me, that I hadn't felt alive in years, that I had forgotten what it meant to be wanted. My confession broke the last fragile barrier I had been clinging to, because as soon as the words slipped out, her breath caught, and I felt her shiver against me. She whispered back that I deserved more than the emptiness I had been surviving on, that I deserved to feel seen and touched and loved. The simplicity of her words hit me harder than I expected, because it had been so long since anyone had spoken to me like that, without judgment, without expectation. My chest ached with a mixture of relief and pain, as though all the loneliness I had buried was clawing its way to the surface at once. A tear escaped before I could stop it, sliding down my cheek, and she caught it with her thumb, brushing it away like it was the most natural thing in the world. That touch broke me open even further. I leaned into her hand, my lips parting with a shaky breath, and though we still hadn't crossed the last barrier, I felt the line dissolving beneath us. I thought of the years I had spent pretending, of the way I had accepted silence and neglect as my reality, of how I had convinced myself that this was simply life. But in that moment, sitting beside her, her warmth seeping into my skin, I realized that it didn't have to be. I could choose differently. I could choose myself. The thought terrified me more than anything else ever had, because it meant undoing everything I had built, everything I had endured. But it also filled me with a strange kind of hope I hadn't felt in years. The fear and the desire tangled inside me until I could no longer tell them apart, until the trembling of my body felt like the only truth I could trust. I whispered her name again, this time steadier, as if calling her anchored me, as if saying it made everything more real. She answered with mine, her voice breaking, filled with the same trembling urgency I felt. And then we just sat there, forehead to forehead, hand in hand, suspended in a fragile bubble of honesty and longing. It wasn't about rushing, it wasn't about reckless passion, it was about the undeniable connection that had taken root between us. My body ached with the closeness, my heart desperate for more, but I stayed in that suspended moment, letting it stretch, letting it soak into me. Because I knew that once the next step was taken, there would be no turning back. Everything would change, and though the fear of that change clawed at me, the longing for it was stronger. Strong enough to hold me still, trembling and alive, on the edge of becoming someone I hadn't dared to be in a very long time. The room felt impossibly small, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to witness the secret blooming between us. My forehead still rested against hers, our hands tightly woven together, and though the night had stretched endlessly, I knew its meaning would stay with me forever. My husband lay asleep in the next room, unaware, untouched by the storm unraveling just a few steps away, and I realized how much of my life had been spent beside him in silence. The years of loneliness, of being unseen, had turned me into a shadow of myself, a woman moving through routines with no pulse of her own. Yet here, in the dim light with her, every nerve in my body felt awake, trembling with the weight of a truth I could no longer deny. She whispered again, so softly I almost missed it, that I didn't have to keep pretending. Those words pierced deeper than anything else could, because she wasn't offering me escape or fantasy, she was offering me recognition, a mirror held up to the parts of myself I had abandoned. My tears came harder this time, spilling freely, and I didn't bother to hide them. I had hidden too much for too long. She pulled me closer, her arms wrapping around me with a gentleness that undid the last of my defenses. I sank into her embrace, letting my head rest against her shoulder, and for the first time in years I felt what safety could be. Not the safety of routine or obligation, but the safety of being held without judgment, of being seen in all my brokenness and still wanted. I breathed her in, the warmth of her body pressing against mine, and my heart broke and healed all at once. In her arms, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't forgotten. I was alive. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, two people suspended in a fragile cocoon of honesty, clinging to each other as though the world outside didn't exist. And maybe for that night, it didn't. For that night, it was just us, the aching truth of our loneliness, the terrifying beauty of our connection, the quiet admission that we had found something real in the unlikeliest of places. When I finally pulled back to look at her, her eyes were shining with the same tears I carried. She didn't need to speak, the way she looked at me said everything. We had crossed a line, but it wasn't the reckless destruction I had feared, it was a doorway into a self I thought I had lost. I brushed her cheek with my hand, trembling, and whispered that I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She nodded, her lips parting in a soft smile, and told me tomorrow could wait. For tonight, all that mattered was that we were here, together, breathing the same air, holding the same truth. I kissed her forehead gently, not a confession of lust, but a vow of something deeper, something raw and undeniable. And as the night slipped quietly toward morning, I knew my life would never return to what it had been. A piece of me had awakened, a part that would no longer settle for silence, and though the road ahead was uncertain, I felt the faint flicker of courage inside me. Courage to choose, courage to be, courage to finally stop hiding. And in that courage, I held her hand tighter, promising myself that no matter how complicated it became, I would never again let myself forget what it felt like to be alive in someone's arms.